Why actually you limited that specific camera with having CLog 2? Because obviously this is a feature which is requested by many.
Great question.
So it's not really a limitation, it's more by design and logic really, because this has the same sensor and processor as the original EOS R5. And that can provide up to 14 stops of dynamic range. And that's why Canon Log 3 is in the camera. In theory, you could actually shoot in RAW and put this into an editing software and transform it into Canon Log 2. And that would change how the brightness is mapped. But it's not going to extend the dynamic range of the camera. And simply because of that, that's why Canon Log 3 is in the camera, because you're not going to see the benefits of that additional shadow information, even if Canon Log 2 was in it.
Okay, I'm sure you have a few questions about this. If you don't remember this interview, this came out right after the Canon R5C was announced. So huge shout out to CineD for doing this interview. And if you're interested in watching the video in its entirety, I'll leave that video link down below. Now, I remember watching this after the R5C was announced without CLog 2. And so what I was expecting after that was that the R5 and the R5C were to perform the same in terms of dynamic range, which is definitely not the case, and more on that later. In this video, we'll be talking mainly about the Canon R5 and CLog 3, but we'll also be talking about the R5C and some of the other Canon cameras. In addition to that, I'll give you a deeper understanding about the differences between the two Canon log curves, and at the end, I'll talk about why I think we're gonna get, or hopefully get, a new log curve and why we need that. So first of all, let's take a look at some tests so we can understand what's going on here, specifically with the R5. So I'm gonna look here and compare CLog 3 versus 8K RAW. And as the Canon person said, when you use 8K RAW and you bring it into your editing software, it will interpret it as CLog 2, which definitely does happen. Remember, the R5 does not shoot CLog 2, but when you put raw footage into your computer, it looks at it and says, this looks like CLog 2, so that's the way it interprets it. So with this, I'm comparing these two images. I do kind of my standard test of me standing in a dark room next to a bright window, and I try to expose as high as possible without clipping the highlights. And this generally gives me a good idea about what's going on in the shadows to take a look and compare two cameras in terms of their dynamic range. So in this example, you'll see that the highlights are a little bit lowered in the 8K RAW versus the CLog 3, and the shadows are raised a little bit. And so overall, you can see that there's less contrast in the image, and if you take a look at the waveforms, you can also see this as well. So zoomed in, you can see that the RAW, you can see more information in the shadows, like in my sweatshirt here, but there's definitely a little bit more noise. But as I said, you can definitely see more information in the shadows. Now, take a look at the graded image. You can see again that there's more information in the shadows, like on my sweatshirt. But if you take a look at the highlights, which if you look out in that sliver of window there, you'll see that the highlights look a little bit better on the raw footage than in CLog 3, and we'll talk about that, more of that later in the next example. So this example I mainly use to see how the cameras do in the shadows, and I can easily, as I said, compare two cameras in terms of the dynamic range. Now I want to take a look at the outdoor example to see if there's any difference in terms of the highlights. So taking a look at the two images, they do look slightly different as they did in the indoor example. So the 8K RAW is definitely flatter out of camera, right? It has less contrast like it did on the indoor example, so no surprise there. But taking a look at the graded image, I think they look very similar, but there's a slight difference here. So taking a look at the highlights, and for this, I would recommend looking at the pavement, like the road. And I think that the 8K RAW, in my opinion, looks a lot nicer. It has a nicer roll off. It also holds on to a little bit more information. And so to me, I see a little bit more information or a little bit more dynamic range in the highlights on the 8K RAW than in the CLog 3. So from this and the indoor example, I have to say there's a little bit more information in the shadows, a little bit more information in the highlights in the 8K RAW than in CLog 3. So now that I've sparked some interest and curiosity about CLog 3, the R5 and the R5C, I want to take a step back, give you a little bit of a backstory and understanding about all the different Canon log profiles that are out there and when they came out and the differences and all those sorts of things. A lot of this information comes from the Canon white papers, which Canon published online. So if you're interested in reading them in their entirety, you can definitely search for them and look them up. They're available. Okay, so the first logarithmic gamma curve came out in 2011, and it was debuted in the Canon C300, like the first version. And this was called Canon Log, or CLog, as we all like to say. So I don't want to get into too much what log is because most of you watching this probably understand this. There's a lot of other videos about that, but essentially the output from a sensor is a linear scale. So what we do is we apply a log curve to that linear output and allowing us to capture more dynamic range. So most of us know that when we're shooting in a log profile, what comes out of the camera looks kind of gray, has less contrast, less saturation. What we can do is we can then apply a LUT or transform or grade it to make it look a lot nicer, but it allows us to capture more dynamic range in the same file, which is super, super helpful and gives us a much nicer image in the end. Now there is a mathematical equation that Canon provides about their log curve, so you can see what it looks like. It's pretty complicated, but it is, applying a logarithmic equation to a linear output from the sensor. 4 years after the introduction of Canon Log 2 or CLog 2 was introduced in the C300 Mark II in 2015. The following year, in 2016, Canon Log 3 or CLog 3 was then made available in the C300 Mark II via a firmware update. So this is a little bit confusing, but remember that CLog 3 came out after CLog 2, that's why it's 3, and CLog 2 came out before, and that's why it's 2. Not that CLog 3 is better than CLog 2. So let's talk about the differences between CLog 2 and CLog 3. Now CLog 2 has more dynamic range, meaning there's more information in the highlights and the shadows, and it's the highest dynamic range of any of the Canon log profiles that are available at the moment. CLog 3 is actually the successor to the original Canon log, not Canon Log 2. Let me say that again. CLog 3 is the successor to CLog, not CLog 2. It handles the dark areas and middle gray the same as CLog, but it gives you one more stop of dynamic range in the highlights. Now to quote Canon here, this curve is designed with only simple grading, just as with the Canon log factored into making adjustments to the image quality. It is a gamma curve with an extended dynamic range while retaining the operational ease of Canon log. Now you've probably heard before that Canon says that they brought out CLog 3 because it's, quote, easier to grade. Let me explain what that means. So what happens here is that the black point is different on CLog 3 than it is on CLog 2. Basically the black point is higher. And what this does is now that the black point is above the noise floor. And when you raise the black point, what happens is you're leaving out some of the dynamic range in the shadows, which there is some noise there. But because the blacks are now above the noise floor, when you look at the image, you don't see the noise, making it easier to grade because you don't have to deal with managing the noise in the shadows. But you're definitely leaving out information in the shadows. Now, I get a lot of comments often about the fact that you shouldn't shoot in a log profile in low light because it's so noisy. The real reason here is that when you shoot in a non-log profile, like a picture profile off or a standard picture profile, something like that, not a log profile, what's happening is they're raising the black point above the noise floor so you don't see the noise. But what you're doing there is that you're giving up dynamic range. So you don't get anything for free. Yes, the image might look a little bit cleaner coming out of camera, but there's other ways to handle that, and I always recommend trying to save as much dynamic range as possible. Now I want to take a look at this graph, and I apologize, I didn't mean this to be a math lesson. If you don't know, I did teach high school math for 5 years, but this graph, you've probably seen this before. I've used this in a few of my videos, and I think this really does help explain what's going on between these three log curves. So first of all, middle gray is referred to 18% gray because of something to do with the paint reflectivity of light or something. It doesn't have to do anything with IRE percentages, exposure, etc. So 18% is our middle gray, as we all like to call it. So on the graph, the y-axis, the one going up and down, is the 10-bit code values for brightness. Now the x-axis, which is going across, are the relative stops for middle gray. So above middle gray would be the highlights, those will be on the right, and the shadows will be on the left. So taking a look first at the shadows, which is on the left side of the graph, so the negative stops for middle gray. CLog and CLog 3, they basically lie right on top of each other. So they handle the shadows in exactly the same way. And if you take a look at the CLog 2 curve, which lies underneath CLog and CLog 3, you can see that the black point is lower, so you can save more information in the shadows. Now, taking a look at the highlights, or the right side, where the positive stops are middle gray, you can see, like we said before, that CLog 3, we're looking at the very top of the graph, CLog 3 gives you one more stop of dynamic range than CLog, right, because it's one stop over. But CLog 2 will give you around 2 more stops than CLog 3. So you can see that when you shoot in CLog 2, you get more stops of dynamic range in the highlights and a little bit more in the shadows. In addition to seeing the differences between CLog, CLog 2, and CLog 3, this graph can provide one other thing, which I've talked about in previous videos about exposing and grading log footage. So what you can do here is you can actually see the percentage IRE or brightness that you need to get proper exposure. And this is where the graph crosses the y-axis at middle gray. And so if you take a look, you see that CLog and CLog 3 have the same curve there. They line up right on top of each other. and where it hits the y-axis is actually at 34.3%, and CLog 2 crosses at 39.8%. So if you've watched those videos before, or if you're looking to get proper exposure on a gray card, in CLog and CLog 3, I would set your zebras to 35%, and if you're in CLog 2, I would set it to 40%. Now that we understand the differences between all these log profiles, going back to the earlier examples of CLog 3 versus RAW, which was of course interpreted as CLog 2, remember we saw there was slightly more information in the shadows and there was more information in the highlights. So clearly there is more dynamic range available in the R5, but it's being limited by CLog 3. Now let's take a minute to talk about the Canon R5C. So in that interview, the gentleman said that the R5C and the R5 have the same sensor and processor. Now, having owned the R5C before, and I currently own the R5, which is what I'm shooting on right now, when I got the R5C, I was obviously very comfortable with CLog 3 and its capabilities. And I noticed right away when I shot in CLog 3 on the R5C, there was more dynamic range than in the R5, even in CLog 3. And I noticed this right away. There's also more dynamic range in the RAW in the R5C and the R5. Now, Cam Mackey made a great video about this a while ago comparing that, so take a look and see what he said about this.
All right, guys, this is just the log footage coming out of both cameras. You see I then do a grade and I'm stretching the shadows and the highlights. On the R5, it just instantly falls apart. Both cameras were exposed the same exact ways. I have the RF 15 to 35 on the R5 and the RF 24 to 70 on the R5C. All right, guys, in the next ones, this is raw mode on both cameras. You can see the R5 just cannot hold up to the R5C. Once you put the R5C in raw mode, it opens up another stop or two dynamic range, it seems like, in the shadows.
So big shout out to Cam for making that great video and a lot of other awesome videos. So I'll leave that video linked down below. You should definitely go check out Cam's channel as well. All right, so clearly in the R5, there is more dynamic range available from both the sensor and the processor, because we've seen this in the R5C having more dynamic range than the R5, and also what we saw earlier on this video in 8K RAW in the R5 versus CLog 3 in the R5. And I also think from my experience, this is true in the other Canon mirrorless cameras like the R3, the R6 Mark II, and the R7. And one way you can check this is by looking at the raw footage to see if there's more dynamic range than there is in CLog 3. Now, I've looked at the dynamic range of the R3 and its 6K RAW, and I think there's a little bit more dynamic range in that camera as well than what's being shown in CLog 3. Now, the R6 Mark II and the R7 don't have RAW capabilities at the moment. The R6 Mark II was promised to have external RAW recording, but the firmware has not been put out for the Animos Ninja V, so I can't test it. But it's really weird that the R5C has more dynamic range in RAW than the R5 because they have the same sensor and processor. Now is the time for a new log curve from Canon. Let's call this CLog 4, which makes most sense because it's coming out after CLog 3. So big disclaimer here, I don't have any clue if this is a real thing or not. This is just something that I've been thinking about and hoping for, so I really do hope that this happens. But again, I have no inside information about if this is true or not. But I would really like to see this new log curve so that we can get more dynamic range out of Canon's current newest mirrorless cameras like the R6 Mark II, the R7, the R5, the R5C, and the R3. This would give us a lot more dynamic range and be competitive with something like Sony's S-Log 3, which is in all of their cameras, and has the most dynamic range of all their log curves. This would also extend the life of the R5, since it seems like we aren't getting the R5 II anytime soon. And if we did get something like CLog 4, this would still protect CLog 2 and Canon's cinema cameras. So as of right now, Canon cinema cameras that have CLog 2 are the C70, C300 Mark II, C300 Mark III, C500 Mark II, and the C700. So what about the R6, the R6 Mark II, and the R7? If I were to continue on with this theory, I would guess that those cameras will not get CLog 4 because there'll probably have to be some sort of differentiator between the R5 and the R6 Mark II because those cameras are very similar at the moment. If you're curious about those cameras and their differences and similarities, I made a detailed video about that, so I'll leave that video linked down below. So you might be wondering throughout this video, Josh, why don't you just shoot it in RAW? Well, the main reasons are the massive file sizes and intensive computer processing that you need to handle this footage. So take a look at some numbers here out of the R5 in 24 frames per second. If you shoot in the 8K DCI RAW, it's 2600 megabits per second. A 256 gigabyte card will give you 13 minutes of footage. 13 minutes of footage. If you shoot in the 4K DCI All-I, it's 470 megabits per second. A 256 gig card will give you an hour and 12 minutes. And if you shoot in 4K DCI IPB, it's 120 megabits per second. A 256 gig card will give you 4 hours and 40 minutes compared to 13 minutes in 8K RAW. Now, I do want to point out that if you are working in a 4K timeline, these 4K modes are actually oversampled from 8K in 24 frames a second inside the R5. So you get amazing resolution, detail, and sharpness. And from my experience, when I look at that in a 4K timeline versus taking 8K footage out of the camera into a 4K timeline, they have very similar detail, resolution, and sharpness. Now, in general, you can get the most flexibility and potential image quality when shooting RAW, but of course you have to deal with those massive file sizes. And I think for most people out there, they're not shooting in 8K RAW on the R5. They're shooting in one of the more compressed codecs because the file sizes are a lot more manageable. But I do think that Canon can do better than CLog 3 in these cameras, as we've seen throughout these examples, right? There's more dynamic range than in these cameras than there is in CLog 3. Now, Canon makes some great sensors, and I have to say that the video performance of these mirrorless systems just kind of needs to be updated so that we can fully utilize these sensors and be more competitive with the other manufacturers like Sony out there. All right, so hopefully you got a little bit more information about the Canon log curves and the differences, and also why I think we need a new log profile. Hopefully we see that coming out soon. If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting subscribe down below. It'd be greatly appreciated. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.